everyone. My name is Sue Ann Trong. I am the graduate assistant at the university's Career Center, and pronoun she, hers. For an image description for anyone who needs it, I am a wheelchair user. I am Asian American. I'm wearing a red top, and behind me is an office space. And today I have Marty Musser. Marty, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, so I'm Marty Musser. I'm the Advocacy Coordinator at Disability Rights and Resources. My pronouns are she, her, and I'll give you a quick image description. I am a white woman in my 30s. I am working from home, and there are some bookcases behind me.
Awesome. So to start off, Marty, can you tell us more about your role as Advocacy Coordinator and kind of the things that you do at Disability Rights and Resources?
Sure. So I'll start with telling you just a little more about Disability Rights and Resources. So we are what is generically known as a Center for Independent Living. There are more than 300 centers for independent living around the country. And the goal of all of our programs at all of the centers is to help people with disabilities live as independently as they desire within the community. So we all have 5 core services, and then, it varies from center to center what they're doing beyond that. But we do information and referral, which is a lot of, connecting people to the right agency if maybe that's not us. Advocacy, which is what I do, and I'll talk a little more about. Peer mentors, which are people with disabilities on our staff who will help someone with any barrier they're facing. So that could be, things like laundry or budgeting or cooking, finding a job, anything and everything. We have a travel training program at our agency called Let's All Go that helps people with disabilities learn how to use and become more comfortable using public transportation in the Charlotte area. And then transition, which a couple different things fall under that umbrella. So that can be helping people who are living in some type of group setting, whether it's assisted living or a nursing home or a group home, to transition to living more independently in the community. We also help people who are at risk of being placed in an institutional setting, avoid that if possible. And then also youth transition. So younger people who are entering young adulthood, maybe graduating from high school, looking to go to college or enter the workforce. We will help them come up with a plan for that. So that's Disability Rights and Resources. And what I do specifically is the Advocacy Coordinator. So advocacy is kind of a big word that can mean different things to different people. So the advocacy that I focus on are civil rights issues and issues of discrimination. And so a lot of that falls under the Americans with Disabilities Act, which we're going to talk about quite a bit today, but also the Fair Housing Act, Air Carriers Access Act. There's a couple big laws that my work falls under. And we do both individual and systems advocacy at our agency. I'll tell you, my philosophy is always to promote self-advocacy of the people that I work with. And that's kind of that give a man a fish and you can feed him for a day, or teach a man to fish and he can eat for a lifetime kind of thinking. So I always want to help people to become stronger self-advocates. But sometimes self-advocacy is not enough to fix whatever the situation is. And so at that point, I can intervene or try to intervene on someone's behalf. But that's kind of our advocacy in a nutshell.
That's awesome. Thank you, Marty. So today we will be talking about hidden disabilities, what employers and job seekers should know, and we are going to focus specifically on the disclosing process. So for those that are not familiar, can you kind of give us a Cliff Notes version on hidden disabilities?
Sure. So a lot of times when we think about disability, we think of the very obvious disabilities. So maybe someone who uses a wheelchair or a white cane or a service animal. And so hidden disabilities are everything else. So any kind of disability that you can't immediately recognize when you're looking at a person. And this includes a lot of different things. So I won't give you an exhaustive list, but I can give you some examples. Typically, all of the different mental health issues that a person might have are going to be a hidden disability. It can include different types of brain injuries, things like epilepsy or diabetes, any autoimmune disorders. So basically okay, so I'll give you the general definition of disability, which is any condition or disease or impairment that significantly impacts your activities of daily living. And so, hidden disabilities, it means your life is impacted by whatever the condition is that you're dealing with. So also, I'll say I should have led with this. If anybody has any questions like throughout, feel free to interrupt. My goal with any type of presentation I do in the community is not to necessarily get through a certain number of slides or pages of notes, but for everyone in the audience just to leave with really helpful, useful information. So if I say anything that doesn't quite track or make sense, please stop me to ask some questions or ask me to explain it differently.
So with that, how are job seekers with disabilities protected under the ADA?
Okay, so the Americans with Disabilities Act is actually a really phenomenal piece of legislation, in my opinion. We do have very robust protections in a job setting for people with disabilities. And basically, all the moving parts involved in that work towards ensuring that people with disabilities have an equal opportunity to participate in the workforce. And so it doesn't mean that you have to hire someone with a disability if, you have a pool of candidates. It's not a quota bill, so it doesn't require employers to have a certain number of employees with disabilities. But the idea is to level the playing field and to give everyone a fair shot. I can talk about some of the specifics. So what's also nice about the ADA is it covers not just the time that a person actually is employed, but all parts of the employment process. And so this can mean applying for a job, going through the interview process, any kind of like post-offer, pre-hiring, in-between space. And it includes also things that you might not first think of when you're thinking about employment settings. So it also includes like the benefits and privileges of work. So this could be things that have to do with like how an employee break room is set up, or if there are social gatherings that are like formalized. So not just, a couple employees going for drinks after work, but maybe like an annual company holiday party or whatnot. The protections extend even to that. So it's pretty complete in what it covers. It also kind of lays out this process for accommodation, which we're going to talk about quite a bit today. But the basics is that if there is something that might help you, whether it's a change in policy or a piece of equipment, that will help you to complete the essential functions of your job. So that's going to be what's listed in your job description. The ADA, guarantees that you have the right to make that request. And once you have made your request, that is meant to trigger what's known as the interactive process, which is kind of a back and forth between you and your employer to come up with and agree upon, whatever it is that's going to help you in your job. So it might not always be the first thing you ask for necessarily. Your employer might come back with an alternative suggestion. But the spirit of the law is to make sure people with disabilities can get what they need to work.
So the ADA also covers the application process too, right?
It does. And so, I think we're going to get into in a little bit here this idea of disclosure and when to do it and how to do it. My short answer to that, spoiler alert, it's just going to be, you don't need to do that until or unless you need some type of accommodation. But it does cover the application and interview process. So for example, let's say you have some type of mobility disability and you know that this interview is going to be held maybe on the third floor of a building that doesn't have an elevator. You can, when you're scheduling the interview, at that point, just go ahead and, disclose if you feel like you are ready to do that, and just ask, can we hold this interview on the first floor, or could we do this interview virtually? So yeah, every part, beginning to end of the employment process is covered.
So say someone has gone through the interview and then they need to request an accommodation. Can you walk us through that process of what that might look like?
Yeah, so in the interview itself, a potential employer can't just come out and ask you, do you have disabilities? The way that question is posed most commonly is, can you perform the essential functions of this job with or without an accommodation? And so if you answer yes, that doesn't necessarily belie whether you have a disability or not. It's just a simple statement, yes, I can do this job. And so I recommend that you don't feel like burdened to disclose your disability right away. There is kind of a misconception sometimes that employees have an obligation to make their employer make them aware of their disability. But I think it's helpful if we kind of shift how we're looking at this concept to, the other personal details of your life. So in an interview, for example, if you would feel the need to talk about, your relationship status, I suppose you could do that, but that's not typical. There's no reason you need to do that. And disability kind of works the same way. I always just kind of recommend that until you get to that point that you need something or know you're going to need something, that's when you disclose your disability. But it's a very personal choice. And so, if it's something you feel very strongly about, this is such an important part of my identity that I just want to shout it from the rooftops, then, by all means, go ahead and disclose at the earliest possible point. But I just always try to affirm to people, you do not have the obligation to do that.
What does that process look like? Like, do you go out and say, hey, I need an accommodation? Does it need to be in writing? What is the best way to navigate that process?
So my suggestion is always to start with an employee handbook or an employee manual if you've received something like that. So go to that and just look, to see if it talks about accommodations at all. Sometimes employers do have like a very formalized process that they want their employees to use. It might include, getting a form from HR that you fill out. I will say, as a word of caution, what I have seen in my work is sometimes that type of form asks more questions than is appropriate for the employer to ask. So, even if you're going to be using a form, just kind of keep in mind some of the stuff we're talking about today, but start there. If you don't have a handbook or manual, or you do and it doesn't say anything about accommodating disabilities, then theoretically it's up to you to request however you want. So that means you could write it in lipstick on the bathroom mirror. My suggestion is going to be to make your request in writing. So typically via email, or it could be a printed letter you hand to your supervisor or someone in HR. Always, always, always keep a copy for yourself. I sometimes will do like know your rights type presentations, and one of my just general advocacy strategies is to put everything in writing, just so there's a record if later on you need to pull that back up, and just kind of keep a basic log of the date and times that things were said and whatnot. So keeping that copy is going to be helpful for you. But I would make this statement very simple. I think sometimes we feel the need to like over explain or maybe reassure our employer that our disability isn't going to make us a bad worker or whatnot. I think less is more here. And so generally just a simple statement of, as a qualified individual with a disability under the Americans with Disabilities Act, I am requesting accommodation of X, and then whatever you're going to need. And you can talk a little bit more in detail about like what the accommodation is or whatnot, but you don't have to give like a Wikipedia entry of your disability and what your symptoms are and your medication or anything like that. Just simple statement, I'm someone with a disability and this is what I need. I do always try to tell people to center yourself in this process as the best expert on what you need to do your job. Sometimes people will make a request for accommodation and leave it very open-ended, where they're leaving it up to their boss to come up with what the accommodation is going to be. And chances are your boss is not going to know better than you do of what's going to help you to do your job. So, be specific in what you're requesting for. A great resource is the Job Accommodation Network, which is federally funded. All they do, their bread and butter is job accommodation for people with disabilities. And so their website, which is just askjan.org, is a phenomenal resource. Thank you, Sue Ann, for putting that in the chat. They have it broken down where you can search by your disability, you can search by your job function that you're having issues with. It's designed to be used by both employees and employers, but sometimes we don't even know what it is that's going to help us. We just know we're having a problem with a particular job task or whatnot. So do a little research first, before you're making the request, just so that you are asking for something that really is going to be helpful to you in your job. But so whether you use a form or you just kind of type something up yourself, get that either to your supervisor or someone in HR. Typically, if you give it to your supervisor, they're going to get it to the right place and whoever needs to be handling that request. But that should trigger that interactive process that we've talked about where you're kind of going back and forth. There are instances when an employer can say no to a request for accommodation, and those are covered under the ADA. But typically the most common reason is going to be that it's going to be a significant burden either to pay for or to administer. This is a huge misconception that's kind of out there, that people with disabilities are really expensive to employ. It is not at all the case. Research shows, there's like multiple studies you can look to for this, but the vast majority of accommodations are going to cost between $0 and $500. Lots and lots of them staying at that zero number, especially if we're just talking about like a change in policy or a modification of process or whatnot. But even if it's a piece of equipment, a lot of times it's not that exorbitant, to maybe get a higher desk or a different type of chair. It's also a one-time cost a lot of the time. So, you get the equipment or software the person needs and that's it. It's not an ongoing cost. So I forget what your original question was. Can you repeat it or did that cover it?
Yeah, of course. I think the original question was just to walk us through the process of what an accommodation negotiation might look like.
Yeah, and one other thing I want to mention just to be prepared for is that the employer can ask for verification of the disability. So don't be thrown if the employer, you make your request and the employer comes back and asks for a statement from your doctor. Kind of similarly to how I mentioned earlier that sometimes those forms ask for more information than you're obligated to share or is appropriate. The same can be true, with this information from the doctor. Sometimes there will also be a form that they give you to give to your doctor. Essentially, though, all the doctor is meant to be doing in this process is just verifying the existence of the disability. So again, they don't need to provide a ton of information about it. It's just a yes, no statement that this person has a disability. I think sometimes where I see employers kind of get themselves into trouble is they ask the doctor to suggest the accommodation. The reason this doesn't really work is that, like, my doctors, for example, have never accompanied me to work. They don't really know a whole lot about what I'm doing day in and day out. So it's generally not appropriate to, kind of put the doctor in that position to be the expert on what accommodation you need. So just kind of, keep that in mind. If your employer does give you a form to give to your doctor, take a look over how much they're asking the doctor, because if it's very much beyond, does this person have a disability, that's too much. So, and sometimes employers, though they have the right to request that, sometimes they don't. A lot of times people with disabilities, we're not pretending to have a disability for the perks. I'll just be very blunt, like, the perks aren't that great. No one is getting into a wheelchair in the morning for the parking, I promise you. So, your employer may or may not ask for that documentation, but just know that's their right, if they do.
So at this time, let's pause. Does anyone have any questions? If you do, feel free to either say them out loud or leave them in the chat. If not, we can move on to the next section. We have a couple more things to cover. All right, so Marty, say I ask for an accommodation and then I get denied. What do I do?
Okay, and so you could call me first and foremost so we can, kind of talk through the situation. And Sue Ann has all of my contact information and we'll share that with everybody. Because, so we're talking about all of these concepts in very general terms, but there's this saying kind of within the disability community that the answer to any question about the ADA is it depends, because it is a law that is meant to be applied in a very individualized, specific way. So, if your boss denies your request, it depends, kind of why, what their reason is. Like I said, there are some non-discrimination requirements that are kind of laid out in the ADA, and I don't want to get too in the weeds with it, but the main reason is always going to be administrative or financial burden to administer. And so if you get a no from your boss and there's not an explanation attached as to why they're not going to accommodate you, I would go back to them and ask what that reason is. It's possible, it might be a legitimate reason. If you were to be asking for a really expensive piece of equipment, I suppose, they could use that reasoning. There's also a concept that an employer does not have to hire two people to do the job of one person. So if what you're asking for essentially is going to require someone kind of coming alongside you to complete your job, your boss could say no for that reason, or if somehow accommodating you is going to create a lot of work for another person, that's an argument they might make. This comes up sometimes with service animals in a surprising way. Like if your dog was to shed a lot and it's some kind of sensitive environment, like a lab or some kind of communications hub or whatnot, that a lot more time is going to have to be spent by the cleaning or maintenance staff keeping that environment what it needs to be. I've seen administrative burden used in that instance, but it's rare that an employer will give you a flat no. But if they do, I would suggest kind of pushing back on it a little bit to either, find out the reason why, or see if there's not some kind of solution that you can find between the two of you that works. If that interactive process does not occur and it's just a flat no, like we talked about, I would at that point maybe start to consider filing a complaint with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. That is something that I help people with from time to time. I never suggest it as a first thing to try. It's kind of an option of last resort in my mind, for a couple different reasons. One, that is a very slow moving process. And so sometimes people think, well, I'll file an EEOC complaint and they'll make them do this. And 2 weeks from now, like, I'll have gotten my way and the situation will be fixed. That is absolutely not how it works. So the EEOC, they're tasked with, enforcing non-discrimination, not just for disability, but for all of the other protected classes, which are gender, religion, race, all kinds of things. And so, as you can imagine, they get a high volume of inquiries or complaints. And so you kind of have to get through the front gate, so to speak, where they're going to field out as many complaints as they can. But so if you can make it, kind of past that first step and they agree to take on your case and perform an investigation, it is a lengthy process. It takes many months at best. So at that point, after they've conducted their investigation, they will make a determination of whether or not they think discrimination has in fact occurred. Typically at that point, they're going to offer up voluntary mediation to the employer and the employee. That also can take a lot of time to kind of run through the course of that. And then kind of at the end of all of that, they will issue the person what's known as a right to sue letter. So you can't jump straight to hiring a lawyer if you feel like your boss has discriminated against you, whether it's by not providing an accommodation or any of the other ways discrimination can happen. Sometimes people think they can kind of leapfrog the EEOC and go straight to suing their employer. Does not work like that. You have to go through the EEOC process. Occasionally, if a case is like egregious enough, the EEOC will go ahead and file charges themselves and bring a lawsuit in their name. More often than not, no, they're going to give the individual that right to sue letter, which you then can take to an attorney and hire them. I'll tell you also, though, so even if you've gone through that whole lengthy process, you get that letter that says, okay, you can start a lawsuit if you so choose. There aren't as many attorneys as one might think who really are very knowledgeable in a lot of these disability issues. So, even at that point, it's still going to take some time. But yeah, circling way back to your original question, if the employer was to give you that flat no and not, engage in that interactive process with you, you call me, I could give you some strategies of how I would respond. Sometimes, like we talked about earlier, if someone's self-advocacy isn't doing the trick to fix a situation, at that point, I may make some calls on their behalf. I'll tell you, this is just kind of true of my work in general. I definitely choose to operate from a position of giving people the benefit of the doubt. In my experience, it is rare that an employer or business owner, whoever, wakes up in the morning with a thought, I just want to treat a person with a disability really poorly. That's not generally what's going on. So sometimes even just by providing someone some information about the law and protection under the ADA can go a long way. Informing an employer of their legal obligations sometimes is enough to get them to kind of rethink how they're responding to a certain situation. So again, it depends kind of answer. It's going to depend on your situation for sure, but there's a lot of options.
Thank you for that answer. Hopefully no one has to experience that. So we do have some FAQs that we can go through.
Sure.
So some questions that I get asked as a when I do career coaching is, do I even need to disclose?
Yeah, so I'm going to go back to kind of my philosophy of this is a very personal decision, and there are a lot of things that people consider, but general rule of thumb, you don't need to disclose until or unless you need some type of accommodation. I will say though, be proactive and be preemptive in making that request. So don't wait until the point that there's an accommodation that would have helped you, but you were reluctant for whatever reason to ask for it. And now you are like getting in trouble at your job. You're having like poor work reviews or whatnot. There aren't any accommodations that apply retroactively. So you want to, be clear and direct about disclosing and requesting accommodation before things start to go south. Like I said, the ADA, it's not a free pass for people with disabilities to either get a job that they're not qualified for or can't do, or to get away with bad behavior or poor work performance. So, be very careful to not look at it like that. It's typically not going to take away like a responsibility that you have in your job. There are some instances so that could happen, but generally that's not the spirit of the ADA. It's just to provide you with the opportunity to do your job, just like anybody else. So before you start having problems, at whatever point essentially that you recognize, hey, something is going to help me to do my job as well as I can do it, then that's the point that you should disclose and make your request. Those two things generally are happening at the same time. So I would say if you're thinking about disclosing and you don't need to make any kind of request, it's not going to be going along with that. Maybe think through the reasons of why you want to do that. I keep repeating myself, but again, it is a very personal choice. And so if you just want people to know, that certainly is your prerogative, but I would proceed very cautiously if that's kind of the angle you're coming from.
So I know we touched on this earlier about Ask Jan, but can you kind of talk about what kinds of accommodations are available to people who have non-visible disabilities?
Yeah, so we can certainly go through, a couple different examples. Again, this isn't in no way going to be an exhaustive list, but kind of big idea. I think something to keep in mind with all of this is to be creative. There could be an accommodation that is going to be really helpful for you that maybe no one has yet ever requested or, doesn't exist, so to speak. So truly like creative problem solving is a huge piece of this. I think sometimes we almost are over reliant within, disability employment spaces on thinking about like existing pieces of equipment or software or whatnot. A lot of times accommodations can be really like low tech, simple solutions, if that makes sense. But so just kind of thinking about different specific types of hidden disabilities, it's going to be easier to start there and then kind of go towards what accommodations would work. But if you're someone who is diabetic or has some kind of situation that requires you to take medication throughout the day, a really common accommodation is just going to be a modification of the break schedule. And so, let's say the general policy is everyone gets a 30-minute lunch and 2 15-minute breaks. You might break those up into smaller size breaks that are happening more often. It could be you just need some additional breaks, some time to go take your medication or, self-monitor different things. That's typically not a big deal to get in place. Something that's been really interesting looking out through the lens of COVID which has been terrible, but I will say there's a little bit of a silver lining for the disability community in the sense that people with disabilities have been requesting to work from home as an accommodation for years and years and years, like from the dawn of the ADA in the early 90s. And historically, there's always been a lot of pushback on, no, we can't do that for a variety of reasons. But then COVID happened, and all of a sudden, like, everybody worked from home, like, very quickly, and we realized this is something that we can make happen. And so that, like I said, a little bit of a silver lining for the disability community, just in the sense that it took a lot of the wind out of the sails of that argument that working from home is just not a thing that can happen. But so there's a variety of disabilities that working from home or setting up some type of hybrid schedule where, you do a few days at home, a few days in the office, can be really helpful. If you have any kind of like cognitive functioning issues or, different learning disabilities, there are lots of different, even just like apps on your phone that you can use that'll help you, just kind of organizationally, whether it's something that, reminds you of different tasks throughout the day, or maybe it's a list making app that'll help you prioritize your tasks. Similarly, you might have a modification in just kind of the process that happens within your office, where maybe you need your boss to always, make their requests for you or assign you tasks in writing. So it's something that you can go back to, throughout the day or the work week as you need to. We mentioned service animals a little bit earlier, and service animals are helpful to people both with visible and hidden disabilities. Under the ADA, you can have your service animal at work with you. I'll say the first thing that comes to mind for me when talking about service animals at a job, it is always the question of, but what if this employee with their desk a few feet away from mine is allergic to dogs? Then what do we do? This does not come up quite as often as some people might think that it does, but if it does come up, that is okay. That person's allergy to dogs should be handled the same as your disability was handled. So they would then need to make a request to accommodate their disability. And in my experience, I will say sometimes the people that balk at being around a service animal, once they realize the process that they will need to go through in order for their aversion or allergy to dogs or whatever it is to be accommodated, sometimes they just let it go at that point. But it just makes me laugh because that's always kind of the first pushback that I hear about service animals at work. But so service animals can help people with all kinds of disabilities. I think, we tend to first think of service animals as like leading a blind person, for example, which they do, and that's great. But there are also so many other things that they can do for people. There are different medical conditions like diabetes or epilepsy that, taking medication like throughout the day can be really helpful in avoiding any kind of incident. So there are different service animals that can alert a person to like, hey, it's time to take some medication or whatnot. They can also be really helpful with grounding, which kind of a complicated concept, I guess, if you haven't heard of it before, but veterans with PTSD, for example, or someone who has really serious like anxiety or panic disorder type issues, the service animal can do things like even just like lean against the person and like put their full weight on them that help you kind of stay centered in the moment and not, do that anxiety spiral. I have anxiety, and for me, it feels very like spirally. It can help you like avoid kind of letting that happen. Lots of pieces of equipment, like I said, or software. So let's say you have low vision, and maybe you just need like a screen magnifier, or maybe you need a software program that is reading or providing audio of the things you're looking at on your screen. I will say technology is amazing in regards to how much it's leveled the playing field for people with disabilities. The different types of software that are out there are mind-blowing to me as someone who doesn't rely on that myself. It's just endlessly fascinating, like the new things that people are coming up with that can help people with disabilities from a technological perspective. Or like I said, sometimes it's really low tech stuff, like, maybe you use a wheelchair and the desks that they have standard issued to employees are just like a few inches too low for you to comfortably sit under. It doesn't even necessarily mean buying, a brand new expensive desk. I have worked with people that, you just put a couple 2x4s under the legs of the desk just to raise it a few inches, and that solves the problem for you. So, it's a vast spectrum of what accommodations are out there.
That is awesome. So at this time, does anyone have any questions? I think we're going to wrap up. Okay. So if you, after this meeting, if you have any questions, you can always email me, or I'm going to put Marty's email in the chat. And I am going to put my email in the chat. Make sure I spelled it right. So friends, are there any takeaway points that you would like to leave our people with? Final words?
I'll close with, so, as we've talked about throughout, a lot of the stuff, it really is very deeply personal to people, and it can be difficult to talk about, kind of in a public forum like this. So I, encourage anyone to give me a call. Maybe you're not even necessarily having a real problem. You're just trying to like think through something, and, you want to bounce ideas off someone, or just kind of clarify, like, what exactly does the ADA say about this? You can call me for anything like that. Or if it's, I know I have this problem and I need accommodation, but I don't know what accommodations are out there. I'm happy to spend time talking one-on-one with people about whatever issue they're having.
Perfect. Well, with that, we are going to stop. And thank you so much, Marty, for joining us today for the meetup.
Absolutely. Call me anytime.